Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing the new Netflix documentary, The Mountain Queen, The Summits of Lhakpa Sherpa. So briefly, the documentary, directed by Lucy Walker, tells the story of Lhakpa Sherpa, the first Nepali woman to summit and survive Mount Everest. It's an intensely personal documentary that not only unpacks Lhakpa's life as a mountaineer, but also her life as a mother and woman trying to make a difference in this world. We meet Lhakpa preparing for her 10th summit, and there is a lot riding on this trip, and to explain why, the documentary takes us on a journey through her life. The documentary is organized according to her summits, and it draws on interviews from her daughters, her colleagues, and her friends. It also utilizes family photos and videos to help audiences understand the importance of Mount Everest and in general the importance mountaineering has had in shaping who Lhakpa is today. By the end of the documentary, you're not only relieved that she summits a 10th time, but you also appreciate and understand her motivations for doing so. In recent years, climbing Mount Everest has become very popular with literal traffic jams on the way to the summit. However, just because something is popular doesn't mean it's easy. The documentary literally follows Lhakpa up and down Mount Everest, and it really dawns on you how incredibly dangerous this trek is and how strong you have to be mentally to even attempt such a thing. The average person looks at Mount Everest and thinks, why on earth would anyone do that? Like, it's something that is hard to appreciate because it's just not something that we would consider. And I think these types of extraordinary adventures attract all kinds of people. They attract the best and the worst of humanity. In Lhakpa's case, climbing Mount Everest allowed her to access her higher self and gave her the willpower to not just survive, but want better for her life. And then it attracts the opposite side of the spectrum. People like her husband, George, who use mountaineering, who use climbing Mount Everest in order to conquer and dominate everything and everyone around them. One line that really struck out at me is the higher up you go, the bigger you feel. However, as you descend the mountain, you feel smaller and smaller and smaller. And I imagine this type of feeling can either be very humbling and fill you with gratitude, or it can be really triggering. Throughout the film, Lhakpa is convinced that this 10th summit will not only change her life, but her daughters' lives as well. And this is because it unlocks a lot of burdens, a lot of hardships, a lot of things that she has never talked about with her family that have just been buried for years. Growing up, Lhakpa was built different. She was stronger, she was faster than everyone around her, and she is one of the rare individuals that actually knew what she wanted to do from a young age. She even grew up in the perfect environment to do it. However, gender norms and gender expectations limited her opportunities, and so her journey to even climb Mount Everest, just to have the opportunity to do so, was just an expedition of its own. And the first time Lhakpa summits Mount Everest as the only Nepali woman to do so at that time, you would think that this would be life-changing, and it was. It did completely alter her world, to the point where she even met her soulmate, a man named George, whose passion for mountaineering, whose passion for Mount Everest rivaled her own. And I thought the movie did a great job of contrasting Lhakpa and her husband to show the benefits and also the dark side of mountaineering. What attracts Lhakpa to George is the exact same thing that tears them apart. Both Lhakpa and George were looking to the mountain to find peace and serenity, and whereas Lhakpa found it, George unfortunately did not. And I think the contrast between Lhakpa and her husband George really highlights why you're doing something is very important. You need to have a good reason. People want to summit and climb Mount Everest for many, many different reasons. However, not all of these reasons are valid. And I feel like that's the difference between finding joy and contentment or just being very angry and disillusioned with your life. For Lhakpa, Mount Everest was not just a way to change her life, but also an opportunity to map out a number of possible new lives for women like herself who felt trapped, felt like they couldn't really go anywhere. And her husband George, on the other hand, used Mount Everest as a way to satisfy his own ego. And no matter how many mountains he climbed, he was just never able to find peace. I found it fascinating that every time Lhakpa summited, it gave her that strength to never settle in her life. Whereas every time George summited, he came back feeling worse. He just looked depleted, he looked exhausted. And I imagine for a man like George, having a wife like Lhakpa, who's just as strong, who's just as determined, can be very triggering. And torturing her and making her feel small was a way to make himself feel big again. One of my favorite aspects of this documentary is the way it includes Lhakpa's daughters, and watching her daughters come to the realization how amazing their mother is. Again, for the average person, it's hard to understand, like, what does it mean to climb Mount Everest? What does it look like to climb such a mountain? And it's not until they're there and they do the treks that they're like, oh, this is what you've been doing? And if your mother is able to climb Mount Everest 10 times, like, there's literally nothing you can't do. And Lhakpa's reasons for wanting to summit a 10th time, again, is for her daughters, to show them that no matter how low you are, no matter how bad life gets, there's always a way through. At one point, she describes Mount Everest as a portal to a new world, a new life. And for Lhakpa, like, it's not just another notch on the belt, like, oh, I summited 10 times, that's amazing. Like, that's not really what she's doing. Instead, it's a rare opportunity to lay any burdens to rest and to literally start fresh. And watching this documentary, like, I was so frustrated because every time she summited, my jaw dropped. I'm like, again? You did it again? Like, that, it's almost hard for us to, like, fathom. And she's only now at the 10th time gaining the notoriety she deserves. And watching her life, you know, all of her achievements have always been a part of somebody else's story. Like, she has never been the center of attention. It was her husband, it was whoever sponsored her. Like, she was never the main focus. She was almost a means to an end to tell some other story. But in this documentary, this is not the case. It's one thing to summit and climb Mount Everest. It's another thing to actually receive recognition and credit for that success. And usually the recognition and the fame does not go to people in Nepal, right? It usually goes to Westerners. At one point, she described them as yetis, these sort of blonde-haired, blue-eyed people that would come and summit and leave. I don't think a lot of people appreciate the amount of work it takes to get someone to summit. Like, it is not a one-man mission. And to think about all the different porters and all the people helping them that have also summited and made this trip multiple times, it's like we're celebrating people who have made one summit. Meanwhile, there are people like Lhakpa who has made 10. Like, it blows the mind. I love that the documentary centers around her summits, because from the outside looking in, we think, oh my God, 10 times, her life must be amazing. She's married to a mountaineer. Like, on paper, she looked like she was living the life. And then we find out what was going on behind the scenes. And some of these summits were some of the best moments in her life, and others, she was living through literal hell. Like, some of these summits marked like some of the worst moments in her life. And as the documentary goes on, it gets very, very personal, and her daughters open up about the trauma they suffered with their father and this relationship that he had with their mother. And it put them at risk of becoming adults that would be filled with guilt, be filled with shame, and questioning their self-worth. And that's exactly what Lhakpa didn't want. And I love the parallels between Lhakpa and her daughters, because they share a lot of similar experiences. Lhakpa spent her whole life fighting other people's expectations of her and her own perception of herself. And depending on who you are, like, your experiences, what you've gone through, it can destroy you or it can free you. At one point during the documentary, she explains how for about 10 years, her husband barred her from climbing Mount Everest. And this was a very dark time period. She lost sight of her strength. She lost sight of her power. For a man who took advantage of her kindness in order to save himself, she never lost the hope that she could once again save her own life. And summiting for a 10th time, like, she reaffirmed that she's not only willing to fight to the death for her children, but she's also willing to fight to the death to save herself. And I love stories like this because they're just such a gentle reminder that at the end of the day, regardless of what you've been through or what your life is like, you are the master of your universe, and it's up to you to dictate who and what you want to be in this world. Nothing is impossible. We are all limitless. We just have to believe it. And so overall, I highly recommend this documentary. I was emotional. Like, I was impressed by how it was able to actually trigger, like, access my heart space. Like, there are moments where you're like you really feel her life and your journey, and again, it really speaks to, like, mind over matter. And if you think and believe you can do something, even if there's no proof suggesting that you can do it. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.